Right, are we live?
We're live.
Okay.
And we're just
Thank you. We will reconvene and hopefully we have Joanne on screen, initials only, but she'll turn a camera on, no doubt. Excellent. Welcome back, Joanne, and thank you. We've had a read through the submissions that you gave, and there are a couple of questions, and I'll just start off with a simple one, really, at your paragraph 5.3, where you say that the relief sought is that the SESM's Ngāi Tahu cultural values and Mana Whenua chapters are withdrawn. But given that the Mana Whenua chapter is a compulsory chapter under the National Planning Standards, it would appear that we do not have the ability to withdraw the chapter as part of our decisions. I'd appreciate your feedback on that, please.
I hope this doesn't come across as sounding like tongue-in-cheek. There's also no scope to put a Ngāi Tahu cultural values chapter in, but that's on the table at the moment as well. So, understanding what you've said, the proposed amendments don't really follow the National Planning Standards requirements anyway.
I accept that, but I was just focusing on the Mana Whenua one, that we are required to include it.
Agree. It's just, when we were formulating our relief, because the Mana Whenua chapter was tied up with the values chapter and the deletion of the SASM's chapter, we just put all three together.
And we asked the question of Rachel in terms of the ability to provide a written response to the additional information that came in. What's your view on that?
I agree with Rachel. My caveat would be, could you please give us actually enough time to provide detailed feedback?
We hear you on that. Right. Other panel members?
What would enough time look like would be my next question.
I think I would ask back, what time frame is the panel looking at?
It's a bit like selling something and asking the person buying how much you're willing to pay. And we'll be posing a question to Council for the Hokonui Runanga if he sees the written response pathway forward as an appropriate one, and only and we'll talk about that in more detail, but 4 weeks.
I'm pretty certain we could turn around detailed comments within 4 weeks. Well, at 4 weeks. As much time as possible, please.
Right. Other questions from the panel? Yes.
I just have a comment, Rachel. I was disappointed that you say the recognition of the importance of farming in the Gore district is also sought by the Southern Province, and you feel that in the way in which the proposed district plan process has been handled will not achieve that. Are you thinking about timelines, or because I feel that we have supported farming?
I think the comment I was making was in relation to this chapter in particular, because we all know how much attention it has gained with the Gore community and in the media as well. And relating back to my comments on consultation, there's been opportunities probably where the council may have front-footed some of the anxiety that farmers are feeling, perhaps at the point when the SASM 01 was notified and there was such outrage about the entire district being called a SASM. So I think there could have been opportunities. We've done our best as Federated Farmers to try and communicate to our members what the plan means and how it works, and the establishment of the working group between Federated Farmers and Hokonui Runanga was an attempt for us to try and understand the plan and the chapter in particular, and we have been communicating that to our members, but we did feel that the council could have done a little bit more in communicating the SASM approach when it all kind of blew up, really.
Yes. I have a question for Joanne, and I'll start with your paragraph 1.6, where you say you support the amendments by the use of a new chapter, but not the manner in which it was introduced. So I want to expand on that. So I take that to mean that the amendment supports the original relief, which was the non-inclusion of the SASM chapter as it was described in the PDP, and specifically if I consider submissions from federated farmers with concern of the whole of district classification as a site of significance. Now that's the first part of the question. I'll ask you both to comment.
What I've actually said on 1.6 is that we support what is trying to be achieved.
Yeah.
And what is trying to be achieved is to find the most appropriate way to look after sites and areas of significance to Māori, because parties are at opposite ends. You've got some like federated farmers who originally thought the mapping, and you've got the Rūranga who doesn't want to map, and then the council, when it notified the PDP, all of the district was of significance to mana whenua. So we're supporting what's trying to be achieved, which must be the protection of these sites and areas. We just feel that how things are being done is just making it difficult to actually figure out a way forward that meets A, the council's requirements under the RMA, and B, is the best thing for the Rūranga, and C, also allows other parties some certainty of not accidentally destroying a site or an area. There's a lot of balls in the air.
I will add to that within our evidence, we talk about identifying known sites. So that, to us, is a somewhat middle ground between widespread site identification across the whole district, which, in our experience with other councils, can take a number of years and be highly problematic and result in overreach of mapping. So we suggest that the known sites are mapped and that rules are developed around those known sites, and that maybe we work towards a traffic light system for consenting, where the more significant sites or wahitapu are, you absolutely need the cultural assessment, and then there's sites where it's a green light and you don't need to have cultural assessment, but you need to perhaps inform the Rūranga. So that's, we're working through things with Hokonui Rūranga. That was where we saw a middle ground going.
That's not the question I asked you, but thank you for that elaboration.
And in that regard, does that have parallels to the Memorandum of Understanding between the Council and the Rūranga, which actually identifies, I guess, levels of severity? And isn't something like that really an implementation tool that sits outside of the plan?
Yes, I think you're right. However, I would see that working with mapping the known sites currently, because we are all aware that there are sites and there are certain areas of the district that are recognised as being of higher significance than others. So what we're asking for is that those are identified within the plan in that chapter.
Right, I'll give you the rest of my question or ask for your comment. First, Joanne, paragraph 4.7, you're quoting the Act, Part 7 of the MPS 2019, topics concerning historical and cultural values, Direction 17. Part D, It describes a schedule that lists the specific or general location of sites and areas of significance. To Mary, when this information is provided, this may be cross-referenced in a appendix. Do you support that position?
Given that the national planning standards are mandatory, I would be very reluctant to depart from that. If I may, what I would like to add is that some iwi have done a hybrid approach where they have undertaken research and ground truthing of sites and areas of significance, and some have then gone to a plan change to be scheduled in a district plan, and other sites have been held on silent files. I haven't recently been in touch with my contacts at South Waikato, but I know that was the direction they were heading in when I was working down there, and I just feel that there has to be a really positive, appropriate way of addressing everyone's concerns. It's just we haven't thought of it yet.
Oh, not necessarily a question. I don't believe I'm leading you because I'm going to be making a comment about the Act. The Mana Whenua chapter is a statutory requirement. Those requirements in MPS are statutory requirements also, Part D. Do you see a synergy between those, bearing in mind that you've submitted against the Ngāi Cultural Values Amendment and the SASM is included in the PDP? Comment, please.
Rachel, any comments?
Might have to ask you to reword the question, please.
Right. Originally, the submission from Feds has been in opposition to the SASM chapter. Right. The evidence from Joanne includes the MPS requirement to address matters of significance to Maori, and Directive 17, Part B, talks about a list of specific and general location sites and areas of significance. You've opposed the amendment as set out by the Runanga. You've opposed the SASM chapter as it was notified, and there's been reference to the Mana Whenua chapter, which is a statutory requirement. There's three things that line up there that are statutory requirements.
Thank you for the clarification. So in our initial submission, I don't believe that we opposed the SASM chapter in its entirety. We opposed the approach to mapping the entire district as a SASM, but the relief that we're seeking is the SASM chapter is maintained with the addition of site mapping. And I think that perhaps when we suggested that Mana Whenua chapter be withdrawn, it wasn't it's not specifically that chapter, it's more in relation to the cultural values chapter and the SASM chapter. And as Ms. Cook-Munro explained, it's become quite confusing and the three chapters have become somewhat intertwined with the different versions that have been put forward by different authors. So I fully appreciate and accept that the Mana Whenua chapter is
You can't
required.
withdraw the Mana Whenua chapter. It's a statutory requirement.
I agree.
Right? So that's as far as I can go.
Okay, I want to start with your paragraph 1.9 and your challenge around the Schedule 1 process. So you're putting to us that an appropriate Schedule 1 process was not undertaken in relation to this plan. So I wanted to ask you to respond to the summary of the Schedule 1 process in the Section 42A that we've heard from this morning.
The intent behind that paragraph was the fact that with all the proposed amendments, all the new information occurring, the deviation from what the notified proposed district plan originally had, people who may have been interested would not have got the chance to comment unless they were already in this process, and that we believe if the panel decides to continue down that road, people need the opportunity to become involved in a Schedule 1 RMA process.
So can I, because lots of my questions I was going through sort of run along a similar theme. So would you agree that the process that we're in, our decision is going to be based on the notified version of the plan as the starting point, and then the full breadth of submissions on that plan, and that the combination of those two things gives us our place for decision? That's question one.
Yeah, okay, I'd also expect the panel to consider the evidence that has been put before it, which is some of that evidence has introduced further confusion and complication with it. So, yes, your decision making is between the notified plan and your submissions received.
And evidence, which is your point. So submissions
yeah.
and evidence, yeah. Okay, so that's the bucket that we've got to work with. Would you agree that in an RMA process, it's relatively common that things move around in a hearing process in response to submissions and evidence, so that you quite often end up with a product at the end, a decision-making panel will produce a product at the end that might look different to the notified product, and that's a consequence of submissions and evidence.
This would be the second process I've been involved in where things have changed, like they've changed from the notified version. The other one was back in the early 2000s with a water allocation plan change for Waikato Regional. The thing is like, yes, you do expect some change, but you don't expect intent to change. So your notified proposed district plan, the entire Gore district is a site of significance or an area of significance to Mana Whenua. We've now got, no, it's not. So therefore the sensitive chapter is not relevant, yeah, but it was considered relevant when you notified. So
let's
I
explore
agree with
that.
the statement in part,
Yeah.
but I feel like for me, the amendments seem to be taking a life of their own.
So I'm going to have to test you on this. So what we've got is two legal submissions, yourself and Transpower, saying at the point of notification, sites and areas of significance to Māori were relevant to the district.
Yes.
And so that's that. And then we've got two legal counsels telling us not relevant to the district. Okay, so that's what's in front of us. If we accept the position that you're advancing and that Transpower are advancing, would you agree that the only evidence that we've got in front of us at the moment to be able to determine that a site and area of significance to Māori exists is the whole of district SASM? because we don't have evidence from us, from anywhere, that we can say this is, you know, giving us an alternative to that. So if we, for instance, if we end up in a place where we're agreeing with the advanced position of Transpower and yourself, do you understand that that leaves the panel in the place of determining that the entire district is a site and area of significance to Māori? Like, the alternative to that, the one that you're asking for with mapping and things like that, it doesn't exist for us. It's not in our purview of evidence.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, but ultimately it is the panel's decision on how they treat the various legal submissions that they get and which ones they find more credible to support the position they want to take. So while I would be loath to have the entire district designated as a site of significance, the panel are the only people who've got all the information for this topic from which they have to make an informed decision. And it is common that legal counsel do not always agree with each other. It's the nature of the beast.
I'll try again. I've got a question for Council's legal advisor. Just heard some discussion on what the panel can consider, the notified PDP, the scope of the submissions, the evidence, and the statutory requirement. There doesn't seem to be, and the statutory requirement, which I've quoted, seems to identify another pathway other than the SASM chapter. Somebody, please.
So that's Council's position, is that the alternative being presented to you is the preferable one. And I would like to pause to refer to the evidence that the panel has from earlier hearings, which respectfully Council for Fed Farmers and Transpower don't appear to have engaged in depth with, and that includes the hearing 1 submissions, but the hearing 3 evidence has not been picked up. Ms Scott yesterday didn't even refer to the evidence that was produced at hearing 3, and where we are today is talking about words which translate some of that really critical evidence, which you do have. So in my submission, this information was provided at those earlier hearings. It was engaged with in depth at the December hearing, and I appreciate that Feds couldn't come to that December hearing, but what we're talking about today very much relies on that earlier evidence. So where you're potentially not getting engagement on those questions, I would submit maybe that's just a lack of familiarity with some of that information that you are a bit more familiar with.
If the panel has any queries that it wishes Federated Farmers to answer, please feel free to put those questions in writing and we will answer those. I personally believe that...
Thank you.
Yeah.
At your paragraph 4.3, where you're engaging with the Ngāi Tahu Claims Settlement Act and statutory acknowledgements, have you had a look at section 2111 of that act in formulating your view here?
I have had a look at the Act and I stand by my legal submissions.
At paragraph 4.6, you're talking about the 6 archaeological sites that are recorded in the operative plan and have moved through into the schedule in the historic heritage part of the PDP. So Transpower also raised this matter, but when you look at the schedule in the PDP, they're not labelled as sites and areas of significance to Māori, they're labelled as archaeological sites.
Yes.
Okay, so
But
you've...
the descriptions clearly are clear that they would be sites of significance to Māori.
Well, I don't know that I would agree with you there. So so paragraph 4.6, you're saying contains 6 scheduled archaeological sites of significance to Māori. So would you agree that you've added those words, but they are not present in the schedule?
No, that's actually, that description's actually in your operative district plan, that they are archaeological sites of significance to Māori, and I just transposed that over to how I looked at Schedule 3.
Thank you, that's an important clarification. At your paragraph 4.7, where you are talking about the direction 17, I've stuck a wee bracket around D. So because we know that we don't have D, I've got a basic sort of question, which is, at the point of notification of the SASM chapter, the fact that that there was no accompanying schedule, which is part of Direction 17, does this suggest that from the outset the descriptor of the chapter did not match the Direction 17, i.e. the way that I've been thinking about what's been happening here in terms of the SASM chapter and then response to submissions and then its evolution into it being described as a Ngāi Tahu cultural values chapter is in part a response to the way the notified chapter was functioning in the plan, and that the way that it was functioning wasn't quite a fit with Direction 17. I think that's where we began in this discussion right earlier on, in when we generated can't remember when we put minute 15 out, it's been, but early on in this process we were tackling some of these ideas, and we requested that further work be done. So that is all visible in the process that we followed to get to here. But it was in those really early exchanges that we were acknowledging that there might be not a fit, like the content of the chapter might have a better fit inside the structure of the National Planning Standards. So does that absence of D, so looking at your paragraph 4.7 in Direction 17, the absence of D at the time of notification, is that a relevant matter in your view?
In my opinion, if you look at the start of Principle 17, a discretion is provided if the following matters are addressed. They must be. So the direction sets out matters that can be addressed, and if you choose to address them, they need to be in a SASM's chapter. But you have the discretion on whether or not you address them, is how I read Direction 17. The discretion is at the beginning of the direction.
Looking at your paragraph 4.7, What I took from that is that if this NTCV does get included, you're signalling that it belongs in the historical and cultural values part of the structure of the plan, not in strategic directions, which is the other option that's been put to us.
4.9, you said 4.7.
Did I? I meant 4.9. Sorry, I thought I said.
Yeah, if you work on I've worked on the assumption that sites and areas of significance to Māori fall under historical and cultural values on a district-wide basis.
Yeah.
And Direction 18 states that they need to be included under the historical and cultural values heading in alphabetical order. So that's how I reached that conclusion.
Okay. But I would read Direction 18 is not about SESMs, it's about other chapters that address cultural values, and so that's what the NTCV would appear to be. So what I'm asking is, if it is included, understanding that's not what you're asking for, so this is if it is, and we've got a choice between strategic direction part of the structure of the plan and historical and cultural values part of the structure of the plan, you're signalling that your belief is it belongs in the historical and cultural values part of the structure of the plan.
Yes.
In relation to your paragraph 5.3, which is the relief sought that SASMs and NTCV, I'm going to ignore the request to remove Mana Whenua chapter because we know that's not an option. But removal of the SASM chapter or removal of the Ngāi Tahu cultural values chapter, would you agree that there remains a need to address section 6E as a matter of national importance?
We're not asking for those chapters to be deleted. What we're asking for is that those chapters are withdrawn and a proper Schedule 1 process is undertaken.
Okay.
So that people can submit on the proposed amendments or other forms of those.
Right. So the request is dependent upon your belief that a proper Schedule 1 process has not been followed in this case?
Yes.
Okay. And so in order for us to accept that, would you agree that that would depend on how we manage scope and response to submissions and evidence, i.e. understanding that our decision, the scope of our decision is somewhere between the notified version and all of the submissions and evidence that we have. And that's the bounds within which our decision is constrained under this Schedule 1 process that led to this plan process.
Yes, the panel has to determine which interpretation of legal scope it prefers, councils and the Runangas or Federated Farmers and Transpower.
Okay, and so that actually is the crux of pretty much the whole of your legal submissions. So whenever I read difficulties with Schedule 1 process, I should be thinking scope in terms of, i.e. there has been a Schedule 1 process, we've got evidence in front of us about all the steps that have been followed in that Schedule 1 process, so there has been one, and it's meant that we've got 150 to 60 submissions in front of us and a great suite of evidence. That's what we're working with that's come out of that Schedule 1 process, and so what we're working with is that scope. And so at the core of your submissions to us is that we must take care around scope.
I think it's vital that the panel takes care around scope, particularly in relation to the proposed amendments that have been put to it. You have done a good Schedule 1 RMA process for your notified plan, there is a risk that with all the new information being produced, that the appropriate Schedule 1 process for that new information, of which there is a lot, may not get to be subject to a Schedule 1 process.
But that would come back to scope. And I guess I would just
It
observe.
comes back to scope. Federated Farmers firmly believes that there is not the scope to make the extent of the amendments that have been proposed.
Right, and so that's our that's where our determination is going to be important. But would you also agree that the volume of information factor isn't necessarily at all unusual in any RMA process? Like, it's quite typical that you enter an RMA process and there is an awful lot of evidence exchange and you know, new evidence coming into play, and that's part of the purpose of an RMA hearing. And so in order to participate in that evidence exchange and be part of the mix, it requires first to enter the process by submission and then engage fully in providing submissions and evidence.
I agree with that to a point. Federated Farmers is not as well resourced as the council. Rachel covers the majority of the South Island, and as legal counsel I cover, at the moment I'm covering all of New Zealand. So we do our best within the constraints we've got. Other processes we've been involved in, we have been given a fair amount of time to be able to turn additional information around, and receiving a 125-page report a couple of days before the hearing, that's not enough. It's not enough time. Even if we were speed readers and we could analyse really fast, it's not enough time. And with this process, you have timetabled each of your hearings topics, and as we've pointed out before, this now and the additional information is now encroaching on our ability to produce evidence for the hearings next week, and it just keeps encroaching. So yes, you do get a lot of information in an RMA process. However, other processes I've been involved in, we have been given sufficient time. All the submitters have been given sufficient time to be able to turn things around.
Yep. So if we address that ability to respond, which we've talked about before, that will go quite some way. i.e., in order to be in the position to respond, it would have been necessary for other submitters to first submit on the plan and enter the process, and then prioritise the bringing forth of evidence. Now, you have done that on behalf of all your members, and what we've been talking about is an opportunity to do exactly what you've just asked for. And so that would mean that at the time that we come to make our decision, we would have that to bring into the mix.
Yes.
Yep. And that also, even though, like, we provided this split hearing primarily because Federated Farmers were concerned about the lay farmer submitter being able to come and speak to us. And
Yes.
okay, so we haven't had that, which is partly why we agreed to the split hearing, was to enable more of those voices to come as lay submitters and speak to us. So you understand, though, that all of the lay submitters who have put submissions in, whether they are in the hearing speaking to us today or not, will be part of our considerations anyway at the point that we make our decision.
Yes, I understand that. The reason Ms Hunt was here today is she is a lay person as well as a lay submitter, and we always prefer to have a lay person with us because they're the ones living the reality of the provisions on the ground. Rachel, being a farmer, she lives the reality of whatever you decide on the ground on her farm, but she's employed by Federated Farmers, so she's should not be considered to be a layperson. Miss Hunt is a layperson, and she will wear the impact of whatever decisions you make. So yes, we did have a layperson at this hearing. She actually flew back early from a holiday overseas to be here today.
Certainly appreciate that she did that, and that we've been able to hear from all of you today. So, kia ora, that's me.
I just want to wrap up something, and I'll actually explore it with the runanga. Not a question.
Wait for the runanga then.
Yes. When they appear, you made a mention of the working group you've got, and I just want to sum up your submission so I've got it right. It's not the appreciation of matters of cultural significance to Māori, but the manner in which they've been incorporated in the proposed district plan. There's not a disagreement there, it's just the incorporation of the district plan. And today, I get specifically the concerns about the predictability, how those matters might be applied within the context of day-to-day agricultural practice. Okay. I'll ask that same question later on.
Sorry, would you like me to respond to that? I didn't hear the question specifically.
Well,
but
I guess you might want to, respond about the working group you got.
Okay, the working group has been a really great exercise. We have gained a better understanding of both parties' positions. We were against the initial designation of the entire district as a SASM. However, where our view has changed throughout the process is that we believe that the mapping of known sites, as I mentioned earlier, could be a fair middle ground, and that was something that we discussed within the working group. Not something that we've discussed recently, but definitely something we did discuss with Hokonui Runanga.
Oh, okay. Wasn't aware of that. I'm finished.
Okay, so thank you for that. Thank you for the Federated Farmers team, and I see that we have Bernadette online who was listening in, so it must have been a quick trip home. So thank you. Your input is appreciated, and no doubt, stay tuned, I guess. Thank you. Now, while there's a change in the musical chairs, just back to signs, did you have an opportunity of talking about that?
Yes, so to build on what we said before, PO under the definition of cultural markers, which is a defined term in the plan, and all rules that relate to cultural markers are dealt with in the signs chapter.
Do the standards that apply to signs apply to cultural markers?
Yes.
Right, thank you. Good morning, and it's afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Leakey. Now, we're in your hands in terms of how we proceed, and you will have a better idea in terms of how long your legal submissions will be. And I'm just wondering, after your legal submissions, that might be a good time to take lunch so that the planning evidence is dealt with in one go, but in your hands.
No, thank you, Chair. That's what I was thinking as well, because I think my legal subs really, I don't want to repeat things you've already heard from me at the earlier hearing, and so really they're just to take you to the updates since then and respond to what we've heard. today. So I think that's a good way to do it. I could go through the submissions, take any questions that perhaps come up as we go, but then leave post-lunch for plenty of time for Ms Behrens to work through her evidence and questions from the panel on that. So I'll just get my paper organised.
Heads up warning, I've got more questions than you probably think.
So it may be that we lunch mid-questions. That's fine. And just slow me down if I'm going too quickly. Hopefully you've got my written submissions in front of you. As I say, I'll sort of ad-lib a little bit as we go and reference also to Ms Behrens' supplementary statement that we've heard several times today is 125 pages, and we make no apology for that, but I'll expand on that and why as I go. As I say, you've had legal submissions from me on this topic already, and these submissions today don't repeat those earlier submissions, and they're still relied on. To me, fundamentally, the issues on the table or the key differences between Hokonui Runanga and the submitters is the mapping of sites versus the alternative approach that's been put forward by the Runanga of particular activities triggering the consideration of Ngāi Tahu cultural values. And Ms Behrens has explained in her evidence the rationale for this approach, and then also the rationale for the relief being pursued by Hokonui of the Ngāi Tahu cultural values chapter rather than the SASM chapter. And I'll just expand on that shortly as we work through. Probably it keeps coming back to the scope point, so that's where I've got most of the notes on this point. But fundamentally, the crux of my case is that it's inappropriate to require Hokonui Runanga to undertake a mapping exercise. And a point I do agree with my friend Ms Scott on is that I don't consider the panel has any, or the council has any legal ability to force that. So that leaves us with, or at the Ngāi Tahu cultural values chapter, and I'll just work through the key responses to the points that have been raised by the submitters on that. Firstly, on scope, as you say, you've got some differences of legal opinion on scope, but a point that I don't think's been addressed much today is what were the tools in the notified version, and how are they different to the tools being put forward by Hokonui Runanga in the Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter. I think that's a key consideration for scope. I look to that notified version as the key source of the scope for the panel. I agree with comments made today that submissions help add to that bucket. But fundamentally, the notified version of the plan notified a range of resource consent triggers, a much greater range than's being pursued by Hokonui, and I'll come to that in a minute. That triggered the need for the consideration of Ngāi Tahu cultural values. And that was in the notified version. That was, all submitters had the ability to submit on that, and that fundamentally to me is what's the top of that scope consideration that really has got us to where we are today. The move from, I'm sorry, I'm ad-libbing here, these aren't my submissions, but the move from sites of significance as a chapter heading to Ngāi Tahu cultural values is one that Ms Behren and I, coming into the process a bit later, post-submission, really raised with Hokonui as a potential option, because we felt that the sites of significance chapter, literally as a chapter name in some respects, had become a complete distraction, when actually the tools being used were non-mapping tools. That was one of the key drivers. It wasn't to change or isn't to change the methods to provide for these cultural values. It's to make the plan clearer and how that's described and where that sits in the plan. So from Hokanui's perspective, and certainly from my perspective in my advice to Hokanui when we were assessing would that be a better way to do this, that was the key driver. It was just a clearer way to describe what the relief was trying to do. And that links to scope, because there was no change to the approach. It was just to make it a clearer approach. And it's a bit facetious. I shouldn't really go there, but fundamentally, the whole district could feasibly be mapped as a site of significance again in a RMA sense. And this rule framework being supported by Ms. Beran would still mechanically work. And in that sense, at paragraph 14 of my legal submissions, I borrowed Ms. McLeod's words because I thought she captured it really well for Transpower when she was describing the difference between SASM and Ngāi Tahu culture values, and said it's possibly semantics and the same outcomes being achieved. So I don't hear Transpower at least as being as polar opposite in their legal position on scope as perhaps as has been perceived today. I jumped across paragraph 13, but that was really just expanding on what I've worked through there. That the Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter largely replicates the approach that was followed in the SASM chapter, and we've heard already that it doesn't add additional consenting triggers beyond those that were already in that notified plan. And in addition, the Hokanui Runanga submission provides any additional scope that's needed beyond that notified version. But I really, to me, that the scope squarely sits in that notified version. So the consultation point, and we've heard this morning actually, I've put at paragraph 17 there that I see consultation really connected to scope. And I think that got teased out a bit this morning, that if you accept Ms. Chadwick and my position that you do have scope, to me there can be no issue of consultation, and I think Federated Farmers may have acknowledged that this morning, that their concerns aren't so much a Schedule 1 concern, it was more of a scope concern. So that potentially has addressed that point that was raised about a lack of consultation. I'll work through Ms. Beran's supplementary statement at the end of my submission, but just to signal, so the Appendix G, which is the exercise that Ms. Behrens and Hokanui have gone through to take the earlier as notified plan provisions, listen to the feedback from Federated Farmers in particular, and it's been a very genuine listening, and really focus up the particular rule triggers where Ngāi Tahu cultural values are either relevant to a matter of discretion or a standard. I think that table there is worthy of a lot of attention when we're talking about scope, and it hasn't had much discussion today, but the reddy browny colour, we've called it red, but my eyes look at it as brown, but they're removing rule triggers, and there's the bulk of the table is a reduction in rule triggers, and I do have to just disagree with a comment made by Federated Farmers this morning that the rule triggers are growing by the day. It couldn't be further from the truth. They've been greatly reduced. In fact, I count 3 green rows, and these are the rows that really, when we're looking at scope, that's where we need a forensic analysis, perhaps by myself and Ms. Chadwick, that's where there's additions being proposed. It's only 3 rows, so it's not a major exercise or a sort of something that's not possible to actually just sit down and work through those additions that are being proposed, and I should let Ms. Behrens speak to it. But one example where an addition is proposed, where there were earlier controls on activities, I think one example was a retirement village. What Ms. Behrens is now proposing as a more appropriate approach is the actual standard relate to servicing, because it's actually the servicing of the activity that's causing the concerns, Ngāi Tahu. It's not the existence of the retirement village. Now, I think there's plenty of scope for that kind of change, and that's one of the three green rows. So, while we have needed to approach scope in quite a holistic way to date, I think once we deep dive that, I just don't agree that there are the same scope concerns as have been raised by federated farmers.
Can I just check that when you're saying green, am I seeing yellow?
There's also yellow. Yellow's the one colour that in my eyes is
looks
clearer,
like yellow.
but it's yellow.
Yeah.
And that's where Ms. Behrens has raised a potential question around just an issue with how the provision works. Then there's
on our copies we've got green, pink and yellow.
I'll ask Ms. Behrens what colour hers, and then we can check. I think it's G. It's at the end.
So it's like a read.
Yeah.
It just depends what the photocopy is.
I think it depends on the toner in your printer, but the sort of the key at the top refers to red, which I see as a bit of a brown, and I can see Councillor Dixon's is the same colour as mine. It's that sort of browny red, and then yellow under that, and then there's the sort of off green. Yeah, that one. Yeah. So it's the off green that I think needs the forensic focus on scope. And the only other point, and I think it's easy to explore some of this with questions potentially, but Federated Farmers raised this morning, if in the event the panel don't delete the chapters entirely, which Hokonui obviously oppose, the alternative relief was that there be some mapping put in the plan through this process, and to me that would fall squarely foul on scope, because there would be a landowner who, through the notified plan, didn't have mapping on their site, that would then have mapping put on their property. And although it's a theoretical observation perhaps from Federated Farmers, I don't think there'd be scope to do that alternative relief anyway. And to the relief that the chapters be withdrawn, I'd obviously caution the panel on that. You've got no 32AA analysis of the effects on cultural values of the district plan not having any cultural protections, and I don't see it as a position that you could land on, and it wouldn't be supported by evidence.
Can you please comment on silent files?
I'll do my best, and it might be, it may be. Do you want to comment on them as well? Because they do exist in the Gore district as a tool. Maybe Terry, I'll let you answer that.
Silent files, yeah. Ngāi Tahu's got a very vast cache of silent files, right from its northern boundaries to its southern boundaries, also down to the sub-Antarctics. And I mean, they're very significant, and they've been actually recorded over time, or when Waihi Tapu uncovers itself, which actually comes through the centuries. I'll just give you an example. When Solid Energy were going to mine here, the local farmers that bought in, done the plough was only it was only metres deep, maybe a metre, and there was a lot of uncovered, a lot of Waihi Tapu sites uncovered. That was probably in around 100 years. Now, when you go from 103 to 4, you get back into the depths, and that's what they had to be mindful of, because they would uncover significant wahi tapu. It's just like a lot of the tauiwi that's actually been covered in the sand dunes as the winds and that shift down in Stewart Island and down the subantarctic. There's another discovery of a prow or a mati, which is a body sort of buried, looking at different areas, buried upright. And I mean, we've come across some significant puzzles to our history that we haven't really, it wasn't really notified during the claim, because they've just come up in the last, say, 20 years, where we've had uncovered upright burials that were actually being pointed in different areas, which you'd think that that person was of significance, that was looking out, and I think this one was looking out to Whenua Hou straight through to Riverton. So it would actually indicate that that person was probably from the Oraka Aparima area. If it was down the Fauveau Strait down to the Ruapuki, it would be positioned in another way. So I mean, we come across those things all the time. We don't actually let everybody know where that site is, because there might be more around it, and we don't disturb that. We just deal with what's there on the day.
So Terry, would they be made available to likes of federated farmers? They were talking about that earlier, that they would like the availability of those silent files if they were purchasing land, to know what was on that land? I don't think that's appropriate to uncover that, but if it was in a resource consent environment and we knew about it or something like that, we'd certainly address it, but we wouldn't actually go putting where our our silent files or our wahi tapu sites, or we wouldn't. We were just like we'd have every real estate agent coming at us requesting that can you give us our silent files, because we've got this land down over there and we want to sell that. Is there any wahi tapu on it? It's getting a little bit bizarre, the requests.
Can I ask, because we've heard it from Transpower, we heard it a little bit today as well, but Transpower specifically were really hammering the potential risk for Hokonui. I don't know if you got to tune in and hear that or see that yesterday, but they were expressing concerns for wahi tapu or sites that might not be well enough protected because they're not mapped in the plan. That was basically their line, and they were coming at it from at the moment this looks less restrictive on us than we would have in another setting, and just worrying that something could go wrong as a consequence. I just wondered if, as Hokonui have been approaching this whole situation, how have you dealt with that risk in your own thinking?
I think in terms of Transpower, if Transpower would actually be putting in pylons and things like that, it would be exactly the same as what we experienced down at the Tiwai Peninsula. The development continued. If there was anything actually disturbed or was unusual, or work stopped. And then, yeah.
So in other words, lots of times during this process, people bring me back to the ADP. Every time I sort of poke this little bear, and it's a range of submitters that keep coming back and saying, ADP, you've just done the same thing. So what I take from that is that Hokonui are comfortable with the use of the ADP to address these concerns.
Yes, absolutely.
And just to add to that, I agree with Terry's observations, and also a lot of the refinement to the earthworks, in particular related provisions, The reason that we've got comfort from Hokanui to that refinement relates to the ADP and its existence and how it will work. So we Hokanui absolutely agree that that's a key tool here to managing. I think. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, I was just going to ask what the process would be for like Transpower if they were looking at putting a line through the district. Is there a process that you would expect them to take to make sure that they didn't go into those significant sites?
I could start, and Terry, you might have a view on this, or you can. No, why don't you start, and I'll follow up.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you look at the Maruawai concept, it was a valley of access from Hangakai. There was trails all through it. One of the significant trails that was at the Mimiho wind farm, where you get up on that ridge line and you see every site in Southland that's in the Murihiku in evidence. Every single mountain range, right from the mid-domes to the Mount Anglin, down to Slope Point, down to Ruapuki, Dog Island, right down to the Southwest Cape. And when you stand on that ridge line, you can, if you come in the back road from Clinton, you've got those passes going into Pukerau, Waipahi, and you identified that it was trail. That was a trail. But you just got to work with the developer to actually help them and get through that. The point that I'm making, if there was any burials or whatever on the way, there was a process in the Māmoe Waitaha days where it was fleshed. It was left there sort of just unbound, and they would go back and they would collect the remains and they'd take them back and bury them. You know, they very seldom buried them on the spot. So you've got this is what's not well understood, and when we're dealing with those issues, we can actually explain those issues. You know, I mean, there's nothing to be afraid of. You know.
So what I'd really like to know is the process that they like. Do they set out their plan? They want the line to go through here. They apply for consent, and then they come to you, or do they come to you to talk about this first before they actually apply for the consent to go through a particular area? How would you expect the process to work?
They usually come to you first to see whether there's any issues or impediments in their way. It's like with Contact, and it's like with Mercury Energy, all the rest of the developers. We have those discussions beforehand, and if there's any issues that we know of, they're dealt there. And then it's up to the developer to actually, if it's going to be in a too hard basket, well then they won't proceed.
So I think it's interesting that you used the word issues, because I've been thinking about this after our conversation with Transpower yesterday. Is it that when a proposal comes along, and in their case it's a linear new transmission line, but in another case it might be quite a different thing, like you know, an area for a wind farm, they have different characteristics as an activity. So does that mean that what is significant in each case will be dependent on the nature of the activity? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, one particular wind farm in the flora and fauna and also the insects, it was a very interesting arrangement there, and so we sat down and discovered it, and it was in the national interest because we need more electricity, okay? And then we come up with a solution that as long as we bund, and we make a bun, and you know, we've got to accept that some of those insects will be actually probably killed, but at least we can actually preserve some. So we actually had an arrangement where we would just bun them, you know, when they were actually digging out the footings, we just actually create the bun. So these are the things that we actually work through on the way through.
And so the point there is maybe that whatever, what's significant in terms of a site or area is more to do with the issues that are thrown up than something static. I think that's the difference. So I'm trying to get my head around the difference between having a static mapped site or area, which is saying these are all the characteristics that make this thing significant, which differentiates it from other parts of the district, whereas what you're telling us is that when you're looking at the whole district, there will be relationships and issues that are thrown up, and the significance of those will depend on the proposed activity.
I think we're only talking about disturbance. It's when something's disturbed. It's when we scan over, if we think that there's a urupara or something there, we will scan over, we might have to get the scanners in. And you'd tell us straight away if it's disturbed or if it was just natural.
And so that's the Wahitapu situation where an ADP would kick in, but you could do some survey if you were a bit suspicious there might be something there. Yep. And that's one dimension of the kinds of effects that might be thrown up by a proposal. Yeah, because you've just described, well, yes, because you've just described another kind of an issue, which was a taonga species that might be affected that you had a particular response for, which is different from responding to an undiscovered wahitapu. Yeah.
Well, you can't, I mean, we work under 4 values, and that's part of the values, so we've got to care, we've got a duty of care. Even if it's not human, it's, you've still got that duty of care.
And that's the kaitiakitanga element.
Yes.
Yep.
And just to add a couple of thoughts to that discussion, sort of for context, I think there's the scenarios that there's the unknown, and that's why there's a need for these higher risk activities to trigger either that discussion or the ADP. But I haven't spoken to Terry about it in the Gore district, but for other runanga that I've done work with in district plans, and another reason why they often don't want to map is that sometimes identifying locations, and it's an unfortunate situation, but it can highlight damage to sites, or it can highlight attention being brought to sites that iwi don't always want. And again, I haven't spoken to Terry about that, but it's another reason that identification and mapping in a public sense isn't always going to be the best way to protect the sites. So I think there's those 2 different scenarios that are quite relevant to the need for that engagement to happen on a more of a case-by-case basis. One point on Transpower that in my submission that there would still be protections is that the approach being put forward by Hokanui is still pursuing rules relating to historic heritage. So in my view, the NES for electricity transmission would still kick in for certain activities, including upgrades and things like that, because there is still protections in the plan through rules relating to historic heritage, which is what the NES hangs off to trigger certain, I think it's a restricted discretionary consenting requirements. So again, that would likely trigger a discussion between a grid operator like Transpower and Hokanui anyway. We started on, I think, Councillor Dixon's question around how would engagement look?
So returning to your legal solutions.
Yeah, and we can. I'll keep going through them. We were up to national planning standards, and you've heard my submissions on this point at the end of last year, and they haven't changed. I agree that the Mana Whenua chapter is what it is. It's a compulsory chapter. I agree with Commissioner Bolger on that. The key here is that the sites and areas of significance chapter is only required if relevant, and in this case we say it's not as there's no mapping, and it adds confusion to have.
We heard submissions that I guess summarise that at the time of notification it was considered that such a chapter was justified. Is there merit in the line that in fact what was provided did not meet the national planning standards requirements and therefore it was deficient and couldn't be retained?
Yes, there is. I think there is some merit in that, and that links to my earlier comment that, in my legal opinion, not using the sites of significance chapter is more appropriate, and using the Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter is a more appropriate approach. So, in a way, I share what I think you were saying there, which is that there was a better way to do it, perhaps, than using the sites of significance chapter. But I don't think that changes scope or anything like that, because we're talking about really like a heading of a chapter. I think it's important to focus on what the chapter was seeking to achieve, and that's got to frame up the scope response in my submission.
Does that relate then to the conversations we've had in the past around the different roles that the Mana Whenua chapter has, and this is canvassed in Ms Beerin's evidence as well? That's got a different role to what would be a SASM chapter or what would be a Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter. And the role of the two things, when you put them together, they're responding to Section 6E. Yep. But if you only had the Mana Whenua chapter, which can't concern itself with managing effects, it can only concern itself with process and context.
Yep.
If you didn't have either a SASM or a Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter, does that leave a deficiency in terms of Section 6E?
Yes, I think it definitely does, because the Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter or the SASM chapter are really where the teeth of the protections land in the plan. They can land in arguably land in either, and it's the case of Hokonui, and it's my view that they're more appropriate in a Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter than a SASM chapter. But it would need either to have to really achieve the outcomes necessary in terms of Section 6. A concept of just the Mana Whenua chapter really would set the context and the background, but without actually achieving the necessary protections and recognition.
So then the only other option that seems to me to be at all present would be a full weaving through all of the plan.
Yep.
And because we've got Ms Beerin's evidence that Federated Farmers also cited this morning, which is that at the moment the plan is 50-50 in terms of whether it's weaving stuff in or not. And so to me, that threw up some interesting thoughts. So question one is, if there was an inclination to move towards full integration, does that throw up scope issues because you would be introducing a whole bunch of new provisions where there were provisions absent? So so maybe we start there.
Start with that question. Yeah.
Start
no,
with
that-
there, yeah.
That's fine. I think if the intent of the provision, as a starting point, if the intent of the provision, whether it be a policy or a rule, is captured by the intent of a provision at notification, I don't think where it sits in the plan is necessarily determinative of scope. So I don't think it creates an issue if a policy was notified over here and it ends up sitting in an alternative chapter. I don't think that in itself creates a scope issue. It's more about then how it would fit with the broader chapter, and would it change the intent or change the effect or what have you. So I think it probably increases the risk of scope issues if introducing provisions elsewhere in the plan could alter the way that those policies or those rules were applied. But in a world it was applied in exactly the same way, I don't think it would create a scope issue because it's sitting somewhere else.
Okay, but the one thing that we might imagine if you were trying to fill a gap and get fully integrated would be that when you go to do that, you're in a particular chapter, so you're more likely to have to move from the broad to the specific in that chapter. And so my reason for asking that is, to me, that might throw up scope because something has sort of sharpened into focus that wasn't there before.
Yep, no, understand, and I'd agree that that conceptually that could raise a scope issue if the provision changed what was initially intended and what everyone had the view on. But if I could just offer the counter to that, if there was a clear policy sitting in the notified version that directed an outcome with directive language, and there was a rule missing or a matter of discretion missing, I think that the directive policy can still give you scope to mop up, if you like, the method that was missing, because the notified version was giving a clear signal of an intent.
Right, there's two different circumstances in my view.
Yeah.
One is where you are shifting something from one part of the plan to another.
Yeah.
And the advice that we're getting is that is fine in terms of scope.
Yeah.
Where the issue arises in my mind is when we look at Ms. Behrens' suggestions that there's bits that are missing, and it's desirable to include new bits. So to me, that raises the scope issue that needs to be looked at in more detail.
Yep. No. Yes, I'd agree, Chair. That and it really requires that forensic testing of that particular relief, because I gave the example before of an additional standard perhaps being needed. But if that's replacing a matter of discretion, then the matter of discretion may have given the scope that you're looking for.
Now, even if there is a policy that deals with a matter, does that give you scope to include a discretion matter dealing with the same topic?
I was pondering that question as I was answering Commissioner Bartlett's. The risk for you that I acknowledge is that policies aren't as directive. They're often not as clear, and if a reader of the notified version read a policy and didn't anticipate or didn't understand what it might result in, then there would be potentially a scope issue to adding a rule that could create an outcome that they never anticipated.
But is a matter of discretion the same as a rule that requires a consent that wasn't necessarily there before?
Well, I don't think adding a matter of discretion to me doesn't risk scope issues as much as adding a whole new rule that wasn't there before.
Right, because where there's a
Yeah.
resource consent,
Yeah.
you're required to take into account the objectives and policies of the plan as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that was highlighted that I'll be asking questions on in terms of the planner is that the approach that has been adopted is being promoted on the basis that the discretion matters only apply where there's a consent and where it's identified.
Yes.
For a designation, for a discretionary activity and non-complying activities, the matters of discretion do not directly apply. And so for a designation, the rules are put to one side and the tests that are in section 171 then come into play.
Yeah.
So how does the approach that's being promoted enable the cultural values to be taken into account through those processes?
Yeah, I'd agree with how you've framed up the question. The policy framework becomes really important in those instances, particularly the non-complying. I mean, you're then needing to get through the gateway tests, and you're going to be applying the policy framework that's being sought. There will be activities that can proceed without regulation under this revised approach that couldn't have before. So there is a risk there in an RMA, Section 32 sense. But that's the balancing act that Hokonui are trying to seek in offering this more refined regime, is that they've identified where that risk is greatest and are really focusing on that. So I think that these breaches of these rules are the highest risk to Runanga. I think to your question of the designation and non-complying activities, we're really reliant on the objective and policy direction within the plan to give any teeth to the provisions.
Right, now we'll stop at a logical time that suits you before 1:15.
Okay, the logical thing is for me to round off
Yeah.
my line. My line was to be...
Speaker.
Oh, speaker. So
Speaker.
my reason for asking that question around integration and acknowledging that we're only 50-50 integrated at the moment, and thinking about how far we may or may not be able to go with full integration, my reason for going there was, if we can't achieve full integration, so under the National Planning Standards, it feels to me that we've got 3 options available to us to address Section 6E matters around effects. So we know that the Mana Whenua chapter can't do that.
Yep.
So there's only 3 ways that I can see that we can do that in the plan. 1, a SESM chapter.
Yep.
2, a Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter. 3, full integration. And so full integration raises some potential scope issues depending on the nitty-gritty.
Yep.
Like you could make it safer and potentially achieve it. SESM has well canvassed issues, but it's not off the table, as we've heard this morning. Actually, both Transpower and Federated Farmers were advancing that it's still relevant. And the Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter, which, when I think about integration, I think one or other of the SESM or Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapters would have to fill the other 50% that is not integrated. I.e., if we take away both of them, we've only got 50% integration in the plan. So to me that leaves a gap. It either has to be filled by improving integration, or it has to be filled by an overarching chapter that can pick up where parts are silent. Would you agree?
Yes, no, I agree, and I think that when considering not all those options, those three options, I think in terms of workability of the plan, and also just a plan user being able to most clearly understand how the plan's going to work, I think it lands back to me on the Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values approach, because I would be concerned at this stage in whether we could fully achieve that integration within the confines of the process we're in, which lands me back at that.
Yeah,
chapter.
and so that to me goes to the part in Ms. Beerin's evidence that I questioned Ms. Bennett about earlier today, where a full review to achieve integration was signalled by Ms Buren. That idea of a full review was also supported by Federated Farmers, but it would seem that we're quite limited to achieve that in this process. It sounds like another process to me.
Yeah, I think that there are things that can be achieved through this process, and Ms Buren has given it her best shot in the appendix to identify where that can be done. And I don't think we should be shying away from tying that off and doing that. There may be aspects that do need to go into a future process, but it's really important to Hokanui that we land the current district plan for, in terms of where it's got to. And if there'll always be future processes in RMA planning worlds, but I think a lot can be achieved within the process that we're in. So that's...
Okay, that's helpful. And another thought occurred to me just then as you were talking that had not occurred to me before, but probably should have, was when we were talking to Federated Farmers and there was that very clear message coming across, we want to be involved in what the tying off looks like, I think, as you described it as tying off just then.
I probably shouldn't have done that.
No, there's nothing wrong with the phrase you've used. But obviously we've got a signal from Federated Farmers saying we want to be involved in what that looks like. We've offered up maybe you could do it by a written response. Another obvious way to do it is by some sort of conferencing, but that might be left to the parties potentially. It's just a thought.
It's a good question, and I'd been pondering process sitting at the back listening this morning, of course, but and a few observations on that. One is that in my experience, what's happening here and the way that the process has evolved is not unusual. This is precisely how almost all of the district plan review processes that I act on often eventuate. Maybe that's my issue, but particularly when we grapple with difficult issues, sometimes there's an iterative coming and going with the panel. Sometimes there's a lot of expert conferencing, and every process is a bit different. Terry and I haven't spoken about this, but to me, I think I've got no issue with Federated Farmers providing a response. I think that would be really useful. I'm conscious as well that this process isn't drafting by consensus, and we can't get ourselves into that sort of circular, and I know the panel can't either. But a scenario where Federated Farmers provide feedback, and I just caution it would be really useful if the feedback was on the actual provisions and the rule triggers being sought. I think that would help.
So Appendix G.
Appendix G.
Yeah.
And that they will, I'm sure, reserve their position in relation to everything else, and that's absolutely fine. But if the feedback can be on the provisions in G, and that at least council, but in my view, it would be appropriate for council and Hokanui to then have a chance to just provide a comment or an observation, but I appreciate the panel may just not have time for that.
And our thinking is the process needs an end point.
It needs an end.
And part of the frustration being experienced by everybody is the iterative process of everyone else wanting to have the last say. So I think we've reached the point of the panel will have the last say. And if you're comfortable with that.
And I look at it because it's about listening and coming up with ways everyone can have their say. Perhaps Federated Farmers be invited to provide their feedback, and generally the council reporting officers would not always give the final position, and perhaps that could incorporate any feedback from
so I guess to share our thinking and to get some feedback in terms of what we've just been having a chat about in terms of an option. And so Ms Buren has produced this material where people said we haven't had a chance of giving feedback, and we really want to avoid a further iterative process. So the parties who have been involved, which is the Section 42A author, Transpower and Federated Farmers, all three to have an opportunity to provide feedback with no further iterative process thereafter. So the feedback is provided independently
Yep.
without any wrap-up at the end of it from the planners. Because really the purpose of the supplementary evidence a couple of days before the hearing is to fulfil that role.
Yep.
And so there wouldn't be the same opportunity of giving feedback. So I'd appreciate, before we break for lunch, whether you both want to comment on it now or come back to us after we've had a break. So I think that's a point of which would be useful to adjourn for
Yep.
45 minutes.
On time.
We will come back at 2 o'clock and just address that further before we get, I think, to about paragraph 3 of your legal submissions.
It's all right. We're covering. I can move through some of the rest of it quickly.
But hey, this is where we need to be putting in the mahi in terms of fully understanding and getting feedback from you all, and we want to acknowledge that what Ms. Barron has done is a tremendous amount of work in a very short period of time, where the intent is to help move it forward, and we appreciate that. It's just a matter of how we then draw everything together so that we can make a decision.
No, thank you.
So thank you. We'll adjourn until 2 o'clock.